The sun was merciless that Tuesday afternoon when Michael Stevens pulled his silver Honda Accord off Highway 95, following the GPS coordinates that had led him deeper and deeper into the Nevada desert. The paved road had given way to gravel 20 minutes ago, and now even the gravel was disappearing into nothing but packed dirt and scattered stones. He squinted through the windshield, watching the heat waves dance across the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush that stretched in every direction. This was exactly what he'd been looking for. After 18 months of sleepless nights, of Jenny's empty chair at the dinner table, of walking past her studio where canvases still waited for paint that would never come, Michael needed this silence. He needed the kind of emptiness that matched what he felt inside. The Airbnb listing had promised complete isolation, digital detox, and healing under the most beautiful starry sky in America. It had seemed perfect for a man trying to figure out how to live with a heart that felt permanently broken. The small adobe house appeared like a mirage, rising from the desert floor with its warm terracotta walls and traditional southwestern architecture. It looked exactly like the photos online, charming, rustic, authentic, the kind of place Jenny would have loved. She'd always talked about visiting the Southwest, about painting those incredible desert sunsets she'd seen in magazines. Now, Michael was here alone, carrying her memory like a weight in his chest. As he parked beside the house, the silence hit him immediately. No traffic, no neighbors, no city sounds, just the whisper of wind across sand and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. The kind of quiet that either healed you or drove you mad. The front door was painted turquoise, with a small wooden sign that read, "Welcome, weary travelers." A note was tucked under a decorative cactus planter. "Michael, welcome. Key is under. The blue pot as discussed. Make yourself at home. Wi-Fi info inside, though you may find the connection spotty out here. That's part of the charm. Enjoy your digital detox. David Martinez, host." Michael smiled for the first time in weeks. David had been incredibly accommodating during their email exchanges, understanding Michael's need for solitude and privacy. The reviews were stellar, 73 five-star ratings from guests who raved about the peace, the cleanliness, and most of all, the complete escape from modern life. "Best healing retreat I've ever experienced," one reviewer had written. "You truly disappear from the world out here." The key was exactly where promised, and the house opened with a satisfying creak that spoke of desert dryness and age. Inside, the decor was southwestern perfection. Native American rugs, rustic furniture, copper accents, and photographs of stunning desert landscapes that made Michael's photographer's eye appreciate the artistry. Everything was immaculately clean, from the gleaming tile floors to the spotless kitchen counters. He set his 2 duffel bags on the bed and opened the windows to let the dry desert air flow through. His phone showed no signal bars, exactly as advertised. For the first time since Jenny's accident, Michael felt something that might have been relief. No one could reach him here. No well-meaning friends checking on him. No therapist appointments. No condolence cards still arriving in the mail. Just him and the healing silence Jenny would never get to experience. That first evening, Michael sat on the small patio watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. He'd brought Jenny's camera, the expensive Canon she'd saved for months to buy, planning to document their travels together. Travels that would now never happen. He'd thought about selling it, but somehow holding it made her feel closer, made her absence feel less permanent. The stars that night were beyond anything Michael had ever imagined. Growing up in Chicago, then living in Portland for the past decade, he'd never seen the Milky Way with such clarity. It stretched across the sky like a river of light, making him feel simultaneously insignificant and connected to something vast and eternal. Jenny would have loved this, he thought, and for once the memory brought comfort instead of pain. By his second day, Michael had fallen into a routine that felt healing. Morning coffee on the patio, long walks in the surrounding, dessert with Jenny's camera, afternoon naps in the profound silence, and evenings under that incredible canopy of stars. He was eating again, really eating, not just going through the motions. He was sleeping through the night without the nightmares that had plagued him since the accident. For the first time in 18 months, he was beginning to remember what peace felt like. It was during one of his walks, following a faint trail that led toward some distant rock formations, that Michael first noticed he wasn't entirely alone in this wilderness. Fresh tire tracks in the sand, too recent to be from his own arrival. Someone else had been here, and recently. The thought didn't alarm him. David probably checked on the property regularly, or maybe there were other remote houses in the area he hadn't noticed. But that evening, as he was washing dishes in the kitchen sink, Michael could have sworn he heard something. A sound that didn't belong to the desert's natural symphony of wind and settling sand. It was faint, almost subliminal, like voices, but muffled and distant. He stood perfectly still, listening, but heard only the familiar silence. Grief played tricks on the mind, his therapist had warned him. Isolation could amplify imagination. The third day brought a shift in the atmosphere that Michael couldn't quite name. The silence felt different, not peaceful but waiting. He tried to shake off the feeling as he made his morning coffee, but something was nagging at him. The house felt different, though he couldn't pinpoint what had changed. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, yet something felt moved, rearranged, as if someone had been there while he slept, someone who knew exactly how to put everything back without leaving obvious traces. Michael told himself he was being paranoid. Grief and isolation were a powerful combination, and he'd read about people experiencing all sorts of psychological symptoms after losing someone they loved. But when he went to make lunch, he was certain the kitchen knife had been in a different position in the drawer. When he checked his camera bag, the lens cap was on the wrong lens. Small things that could easily be explained by his own distracted state of mind, but things that felt deliberate. That afternoon, during his usual walk, Michael decided to explore a bit further than usual. The desert held a strange beauty, harsh and unforgiving, but somehow honest in its emptiness. He was photographing a particularly striking formation of red rocks when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the sand near the rocks, partially hidden by a scattered pile of stones, was something that definitely didn't belong in the wilderness. A cell phone, an iPhone in a bright pink case, half buried and obviously abandoned for some time. The screen was cracked, the case sun-bleached, but it was undeniably recent technology. Michael looked around, but there was no sign of whoever had lost it. No footprints, no other belongings, no indication of how it had gotten there. He picked it up carefully, though he knew the chances of it still working were slim. The battery was completely dead, and sand had worked its way into every crevice. But seeing it there, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the desert wind. People didn't just drop their phones in the wilderness and walk away, not unless something had happened to them. Standing there in the vastness of the Nevada desert, holding a stranger's phone, Michael felt the first real fear he'd experienced since arriving at the house. The isolation that had seemed so healing suddenly felt threatening. The silence that had brought him peace now seemed to hide secrets. For the first time since Jenny's death, Michael was afraid of something other than his own grief. That evening, he couldn't concentrate on the sunset or the stars. The pink phone sat on the kitchen table like an accusation, making him question everything about his peaceful retreat. He'd planned to stay for a full week, but now he found himself calculating how quickly he could pack and return to civilization. The thought of spending another night in the house filled him with an anxiety he couldn't name. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Michael locked the front door and checked the windows twice. He'd never felt the need to lock anything during his stay, but tonight the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The silence that had been so healing now seemed to press against the walls, thick with unspoken secrets. He was washing his face in the bathroom when he heard it again, that muffled sound, like voices carrying from a great distance. This time, he was certain it wasn't his imagination. Someone was talking, somewhere nearby, their words indistinct but their presence undeniable. Michael grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the patio, scanning the darkness for any sign of other people. The desert night was impenetrable, but the voices continued. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like ghosts. Michael's heart pounded as he realized the truth that had been trying to surface all day. He wasn't alone here. he never had been. Someone was watching him. Someone had been in the house while he slept. Someone knew exactly how to move through this isolated place without being seen. And somewhere out in that vast darkness, someone else had lost more than just their phone. As Michael stood on the patio, flashlight shaking in his hand, the voices faded into silence. But the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the held breath of something waiting to happen, something that had been planned long before he'd ever heard of this place, long before he'd needed somewhere to heal his broken heart. The healing he'd come here to find was about to take a turn he never could have imagined. In the morning, he would make a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about the charming adobe house in the middle of nowhere. A discovery that would connect the pink phone to a mystery much larger and more terrifying than one lost tourist in the desert. But tonight, Michael Stevens went to sleep for the last time, believing he was just a grieving widower trying to find peace in the wilderness. Tomorrow he would wake up to find himself at the center of something much darker, something that had been waiting in the shadows of the desert for him to arrive. The house held its secrets through the night, patient as the desert itself, while Michael slept his last innocent sleep. Outside, the wind whispered across the sand, carrying voices and warnings that only the darkness could hear. Michael woke to the sound of complete silence, but something felt wrong. The quality of the quiet had changed during the night, becoming thick and oppressive like the air before a storm. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to identify what had pulled him from sleep. It wasn't a sound, it was the absence of sound. Even the wind had stopped. As consciousness fully returned, Michael became aware of a smell he hadn't noticed before. Something faint but unmistakable, the odor of something organic and unpleasant, like food that had been left out too long in the heat. He'd noticed it briefly the night before, but had attributed it to his imagination, or perhaps some natural desert process he didn't understand. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, the smell seemed stronger. Michael checked his watch. 4:47 a.m. Still, hours before sunrise, but he knew he wouldn't be able to fall back asleep. The events of the previous day, finding the phone, hearing the voices, had left him on edge in a way that felt both rational and deeply unsettling. He needed coffee, needed to think clearly about what he'd experienced and what he should do next. In the kitchen, as he fumbled for the light switch, his hand touched something that shouldn't have been there. The switch was sticky, as if someone had handled it with wet fingers. Michael jerked his hand back, heart racing, before forcing himself to turn on the light. Everything looked normal, exactly as he'd left it the night before, including the pink phone still sitting on the table like an unanswered question. But the stickiness on the light switch was real, and when Michael looked closely, he could see faint marks on the white. Plastic, marks that looked suspiciously like fingerprints that weren't quite dry. Someone had been in the house while he slept. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had walked through these rooms, had touched the light switch, had moved silently through the darkness, while Michael lay unconscious and vulnerable just feet away. The locked door meant nothing. Whoever it was had access to this place in ways Michael couldn't begin to understand. His hands shook as he made coffee, the familiar routine providing a small anchor in a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his comprehension. Every shadow seemed threatening now. Every normal house sound carried the possibility of an intruder. The isolation that had promised healing now felt like a trap, designed specifically for him. As the coffee brewed, Michael tried to think rationally about his options. He could pack up and leave immediately, drive back to Vegas and catch the first flight to Portland. But something held him back. Maybe it was photographer's curiosity, or maybe it was the stubborn grief that had made him reckless about his own safety since Jenny's death. Whatever it was, he needed to understand what was happening here before he ran away. The pink phone seemed to stare at him accusingly from the table. Someone had lost it, someone who might need help, someone who might be in danger. Michael couldn't just ignore that possibility, no matter how frightened he was becoming. As dawn approached, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to search the area more thoroughly, look for clues about who the phone belonged to and how it had ended up abandoned in the desert. If there were answers to be found, he was going to find them. The sun was just touching the horizon when Michael set out, carrying Jenny's camera and a bottle of water. The desert in early morning was breathtakingly beautiful, all golden pink light stretching across sand that looked like it had never been touched by human feet. But Michael's appreciation for the beauty was overshadowed by a growing sense that he was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, the kind of primitive awareness that had kept humans alive for millennia. But as he walked further from the house, following the faint trail he'd discovered the day before, the feeling grew stronger. Someone was out there, hidden among the rocks and scrub brush, tracking his movements. Michael stopped several times, pretending to adjust his camera settings while scanning the landscape for any sign of another person. The desert appeared empty, but appearances in this harsh environment could be deceiving. There were countless hiding places among the rock formations and dried creek beds, countless ways for someone to move unseen across terrain they knew intimately. It was near the spot where he'd found the phone that Michael made his second disturbing discovery. Partially hidden beneath a large boulder, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was something that made his stomach clench with dread. A piece of fabric, bright blue and obviously synthetic, caught on the sharp edge of the rock. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket or shirt, and it was recent enough that the desert sun hadn't completely faded the color. Michael photographed it carefully before picking it up. The fabric was expensive, the kind used in high-end outdoor gear. Someone wearing quality hiking clothes had been here recently, and they'd left this piece behind under circumstances that had involved force or struggle. As he examined the fabric, Michael became aware of the smell again, that organic, unpleasant odor he'd noticed at the house. It was stronger here, carried on the morning breeze from somewhere deeper in the desert. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And Michael was beginning to understand that his peaceful retreat had placed him in the middle of a situation far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. But it was what he found next that changed everything. Following the smell, Michael climbed a small rise that offered a better view of the surrounding area. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but his photographer's trained eye caught something that didn't belong. About half a mile away, near a cluster of rock formations, there was a dark spot in the sand. It could have been shadow, could have been natural discoloration, but something about its shape and position struck him as artificial. Michael used the camera's zoom lens to get a better look, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't shadow or natural discoloration. It was a pile of disturbed earth, the kind that looked suspiciously like someone had been digging. And scattered around the disturbed area were more pieces of fabric, more personal items, more signs that people had been here recently under circumstances that hadn't ended well. Michael's hands shook as he lowered the camera. He was looking at what could only be described as a burial site, and judging by the multiple pieces of debris scattered around it, it wasn't the grave of just one person. The peaceful Airbnb rental in the middle of the Nevada desert was beginning to reveal its true nature, and Michael Stevens was starting to understand that he hadn't come here to heal. He'd come here to disappear. Just like the owner of the pink phone, just like the person who'd lost the piece of blue fabric, just like however many others had made the mistake of thinking this isolated house would be their sanctuary instead of their tomb. As Michael stood on that rise, staring at evidence of something unspeakable, he heard a sound that made his soul freeze. The distant rumble of an engine getting closer. Someone was coming, someone who knew exactly where he was and exactly what he'd discovered. Michael ran. He ran back toward the house with the desperate speed of someone who finally understood the true nature of his situation. Behind him, the engine sound grew louder, more urgent, as if the driver had seen him and was giving chase. The isolation that had seemed so healing now revealed itself as the perfect trap. No neighbors to hear screams, no witnesses to see what happened, no one to ask questions when another guest simply vanished into the vastness of the desert. The time Michael reached the house, his lungs were burning and his heart felt like it might explode. But he didn't stop to rest. He burst through the front door, grabbed his packed duffel bags and ran for his car. If he could just reach the highway, if he could just get back to civilization, he could report what he'd found and let the authorities handle whatever evil had been happening in this place. But as Michael threw his bags into the Honda and fumbled for his keys, he made a discovery that destroyed his last hope of escape. His tires had been slashed, all four of them, cut with surgical precision while he'd been sleeping. His car wasn't going anywhere. Michael stood in the morning sun, staring at his disabled vehicle, and felt the full weight of his situation crash down on him. He was trapped in the middle of the desert, with someone who had been planning his disappearance from the moment he'd made his reservation. Someone who knew exactly how to isolate their victims, how to strip away their options one by one until there was nowhere left to run. The engine sound was getting closer, and Michael could see a dust cloud on the horizon marking the approach of his pursuer. He had maybe 10 minutes before they arrived, 10 minutes to figure out how to survive a situation that had been designed to be unsurvivable. That's when he noticed something he'd missed before. The house itself was larger than it appeared from the outside, and there were architectural details that didn't quite make sense. Windows that seemed to be in the wrong places, subtle variations in the stonework that suggested the building had been modified in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Michael had spent enough time around construction sites during his photography career to recognize the signs of unpermitted renovation work. This house had secrets built into its very structure, secrets that might hold the key to understanding what had happened to all the people who'd disappeared here. Secrets that might also hold the key to his survival. With the sound of approaching doom growing louder by the second, Michael made a decision that went against every instinct screaming at him to run. Instead of fleeing into the desert where he'd surely be caught, he was going back into the house. He was going to find whatever David Martinez had been hiding, and he was going to use it to fight back. As Michael ran back toward the turquoise door, he could only pray that whatever secrets the house held would be enough to keep him alive long enough to expose the truth about what had been happening in this isolated corner of hell. The desert had kept its secrets for years, but Michael Stevens was about to uncover them all. Behind him, the dust cloud grew larger, and the sound of the approaching vehicle carried a promise of violence that made the morning air feel thick with dread. Someone was coming to add Michael to the collection of missing people who'd made the fatal mistake of thinking this place would heal them instead of destroy them. But Michael wasn't going to disappear quietly. He was going to fight, and he was going to make sure that when this was over, the truth about the desert house would finally see the light of day, even if he didn't survive to tell it himself. The front door slammed behind Michael with a finality that seemed to echo through the house like a death knell. His heart hammered against his ribs as he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath and think clearly about his impossible situation. Outside, the engine sound was getting closer, maybe 5 minutes away now, maybe less. Michael's eyes swept the interior of the house with new awareness, seeing it not as the charming retreat he'd thought it was, but as a carefully constructed trap. Every detail that had seemed so welcoming now felt sinister. The Native American rugs could hide trapdoors. The copper accents could conceal cameras. The photographs of beautiful desert landscapes might be documenting the final views that other victims had seen before they vanished forever. But it was the architecture itself that held his attention now. Michael had photographed enough buildings to understand structural logic, and this house violated that logic in subtle but significant ways. The rooms were slightly smaller than they should be, given the exterior dimensions. There were load-bearing, walls in places where they weren't needed. Most tellingly, there was a section of the house where the floor felt different underfoot, hollow, as if there was empty space beneath. Michael dropped to his knees in the kitchen, running his hands across the tile floor, feeling for variations in sound and stability. Near the center of the room, just in front of the refrigerator, he found what he was looking for. A section about 3 feet square that sounded distinctly hollow when tapped, as if there was a cavity beneath. The sound of the approaching vehicle was getting louder. Michael could hear it clearly now, the growl of a heavy truck or SUV being driven hard across the rough desert terrain. Whoever was coming, they weren't concerned about being subtle anymore. They knew he'd found something, and they were racing to stop him before he could do anything about it. Working frantically, Michael searched the kitchen for anything that might reveal how to access the hidden space beneath the floor. His hands shook as he opened cabinets, pulled out drawers, examined every surface for a trigger or mechanism. It had to be here, somewhere. These kinds of hidden rooms always had access points, usually concealed but accessible to someone who knew where to look. It was behind the wooden panel beside the refrigerator that Michael's desperate search finally paid off. Hidden, in the decorative groove of the wood, was a small lever, painted to match the surrounding material so perfectly that it was nearly invisible. When Michael pressed it, he felt it give slightly, and somewhere beneath the floor he heard the sound of mechanical movement. A section of the kitchen floor swung open like a trapdoor, revealing a set of metal stairs that descended into darkness. The smell that had been haunting the house for days wafted up from below, stronger now, unmistakably organic and wrong. But there was no choice. The vehicle outside was close enough now that Michael could hear the engine strain as it navigated, the rough terrain leading to the house. Taking a deep breath that he hoped wouldn't be among his last, Michael descended into the hidden basement of the desert house. What he found there defied his worst fears and exceeded his most paranoid imaginations. The underground room was extensive, clearly professionally constructed, with acoustic tiles covering every surface to muffle sound. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams, and the walls were lined with electronic equipment that looked both expensive and sophisticated. Banks of monitors showed views from hidden cameras positioned throughout the house and surrounding desert, including several that had been watching Michael's every move since his arrival. But it was the center of the room that made Michael's legs nearly give out beneath him. A metal chair was bolted to the concrete floor, surrounded by cameras positioned at different angles, to capture every detail of whatever happened there. The chair was equipped with restraints, and dark stains on the concrete around it told a story that Michael's mind desperately wanted to reject. Shelves along the walls held dozens of personal items, wallets, jewelry, phones, pieces of clothing, cameras, and other belongings that could only have come from previous victims. Michael recognized the pink phone case immediately among the collection, but there were so many other items that it was clear this operation had been going on for years. On a desk in one corner, Michael found journals filled with meticulous notes. Names, dates, physical descriptions, detailed observations about the victim's behavior patterns, and psychological profiles. David Martinez, if that was even his real name, had been studying his guests like laboratory specimens, documenting every aspect of their visits before they disappeared forever. But it was the computer monitors that revealed the true scope of the horror. The screens showed live feeds from other properties, other remote houses in the desert that looked identical to the one Michael was trapped in, other isolated Airbnb rentals where other unsuspecting guests were probably experiencing the same false sense of peace and safety that Michael had felt just days ago. This wasn't the work of one man. This was an organized network, a systematic operation designed to make people disappear without a trace. The desert house was just one node in a web of death that stretched across the southwest, all of it hidden behind the friendly facade of vacation rentals and digital detox retreats. Michael's hands shook as he used his phone to photograph everything he could see, though the lack of signal meant the images would be trapped on the device until he could reach civilization. If he could reach civilization. The sound of the vehicle had stopped, and Michael could hear footsteps on the patio above. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. A voice called out, friendly and concerned. "Michael, are you okay in there? We saw your car had some trouble with the tires. We're here to help." It was David Martinez's voice, the same warm tone he'd used in their email exchanges. But now Michael could hear the predatory satisfaction underneath the false concern. David knew exactly what had happened to the tires, just as he knew exactly what was going to happen to Michael. "We know you found some things that probably confused you," David continued, his voice getting closer as he apparently moved through the house. "Why don't you come out so we can explain everything? There's been a misunderstanding." Michael pressed himself against the wall of the underground room, trying to think of any possible way out of his situation. The metal stairs were the only exit he could see, and they led directly back into the house where David and his accomplices were waiting. But maybe if he was careful, if he was smart, he could use what he'd learned down here to turn the tables. The desk held more than just journals. There were floor plans of all the houses in the network, complete with details about their hidden rooms and escape routes. Contact information for other members of the organization, including what appeared to be cleanup crews and disposal specialists. Most importantly, there were detailed schedules showing when each property would be occupied and by whom. Michael was studying these documents when he heard something that made his blood freeze. The mechanical sound of the trapdoor closing above him. David had found the hidden entrance, and instead of coming down to confront Michael directly, he'd chosen to trap him in the underground chamber. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans." "Michael," David's voice came through speakers hidden in the acoustic tiles. His friendly facade had completely dropped now, replaced by the cold efficiency of a predator who no longer needed to pretend. "You've seen too much, learned too much. We can't let you leave." The lights in the underground room flickered and went out, plunging Michael into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the space feel even more like a tomb. From somewhere in the darkness, Michael could hear the sound of ventilation systems shutting down, sealing, him in with the stale air and the overwhelming smell of death. "You wanted isolation, Michael," David's voice continued, now carrying a note of genuine amusement. "How you wanted to disappear from the world. Congratulations, you're about to get exactly what you asked for." But David Martinez had made one crucial mistake. In his confidence that Michael was trapped and helpless, he'd overlooked the photographer's most important tool. While the underground chamber had no cell signal, Michael's camera had been recording everything since he'd first descended the stairs. Every piece of evidence, every document, every detail of the operation was now documented in high-definition digital files. More importantly, Michael had found something else among the equipment in the room. A hardwired internet connection that David used to monitor his network of death houses. If Michael could access that connection, if he could upload his photos and the evidence he'd gathered, then even if he didn't survive, the truth about what was happening in the desert would survive him. As the red emergency lights cast hellish shadows on the walls, Michael Stevens began to fight for his life in the only way that mattered. Not with violence or desperate escape, attempts, but with the truth. He was going to make sure that every piece of evidence, every victim's story, every detail of David Martinez's operation would see the light of day. The desert had kept its secrets for too long. It was time for them to be exposed, no matter what the cost. Above him, Michael could hear movement as David and his team prepared for whatever they had planned. But below, in the tomb they'd created for him, Michael was working furiously to ensure that their reign of terror was about to come to an end. The battle for truth was just beginning, and Michael Stevens refused to go quietly into the desert night. The hardwired internet connection was hidden behind a false panel, but Michael's desperate search finally uncovered it. His hands trembled as he connected his camera to the system, praying that David's overconfidence had left this crucial link unprotected. The upload progress bar crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Photos of the evidence, copies of the documents, everything he'd discovered about the network of death houses spreading across the southwest. Above him, the sounds of movement continued. Footsteps, muffled conversations, the scraping of heavy objects being moved around. David and his team were preparing something, and Michael didn't want to imagine what it might be. The ventilation had been shut off for 20 minutes now, and the air in the underground chamber was becoming thick and stale. Time was running out in more ways than one. But as the files uploaded, Michael made a discovery that changed everything. He thought he knew about his situation. Hidden in the deepest directory of David's computer system was a folder labeled Special Cases, and when Michael opened it, he found himself staring at his own photograph. Not a recent photo from the security cameras, but an older image from his photography website. His professional headshot, accompanied by a detailed file that contained information about his personal life, his marriage to Jenny, her death in the car accident, his subsequent depression and isolation. Everything that had led him to seek out this remote retreat had been documented, studied, planned for. Michael Stevens hadn't stumbled into this trap by accident. He'd been specifically targeted, recruited, lured here by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a grieving man's need for healing and solitude. The file contained email exchanges between David and someone identified only as the coordinator, discussing Michael's psychological profile and his suitability for what they called the program. They'd monitored his online activity, tracked his searches for remote rentals, even influenced the search results to ensure he'd find David's listing. Subject: shows classic isolation-seeking behavior following traumatic loss, one email read. High-value target due to professional skills and limited social connections. Recommend standard approach with extended timeline. Michael's stomach turned as he realized the full scope of the manipulation. They hadn't just been waiting for random victims to stumble into their web. They'd been actively hunting, identifying vulnerable people and drawing them in with carefully crafted scenarios designed to exploit their specific psychological needs. Jenny's death had made him the perfect target. A successful photographer with valuable equipment, a man isolated by grief, someone whose disappearance might be attributed to suicide or a desire to start over somewhere else. The kind of person who could vanish without generating the immediate, intensive search that might uncover the truth. As Michael processed this horrible revelation, the upload finally completed. Every piece of evidence was now stored on secure servers thousands of miles away, beyond David's reach. Even if Michael didn't survive the next few hours, the truth about the Desert House network would eventually surface. But Michael wasn't ready to die. Not when he finally understood the full scope of what he was fighting against. Using David's own computer system, Michael began to dig deeper into the network's operations. What he found was a sophisticated organization that had been operating for over 5 years, with properties scattered across Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Dozens of victims, all carefully selected and lured to their deaths with the same psychological precision that had been used on Michael. The organization wasn't just killing people, they were harvesting them. The valuable equipment, jewelry, and personal belongings were being sold through carefully constructed online networks. The victims' identities were being used for financial fraud. Even their deaths were being monetized through dark web content that Michael couldn't bear to examine too closely. But it was the client list that made Michael's blood run cold. Names, addresses, and payment records for people who were paying substantial amounts to access the network's services. Wealthy individuals who were purchasing not just the victims' belongings, but access to the underground chambers themselves. The metal chair in the center of the room wasn't just for restraint, it was for entertainment. Michael was staring at evidence of an operation that went far beyond simple murder. This was a business, a carefully structured enterprise that treated human beings as products to be harvested and consumed by people with enough money to indulge their darkest appetites. The sound of machinery starting up somewhere above interrupted his investigation. A mechanical humming that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, accompanied by a subtle change in air pressure that made Michael's ears pop. David was activating some kind of system, something that had been built into the structure of the house itself. "I hope you're enjoying your research, Michael." David's voice came through the speakers, tinged with amusement. "You always were, thorough in your work. Jenny used to brag about your attention to detail." Michael's heart stopped. David knew about Jenny, not just from the surveillance files, but personally. The casual way he'd mentioned her name suggested a familiarity that went beyond psychological profiling. "Oh yes," David continued, as if reading Michael's thoughts. "We've been watching you for much longer than you realize. Jenny's accident wasn't quite as random as the police reports made it seem." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Jenny's death, the car accident that had shattered his world and led him to this place, hadn't been an accident at all. It had been the first step in a plan that had taken 18 months to fully execute. They'd killed his wife to create the psychological conditions that would make him vulnerable to their manipulation. "She was never supposed to be part of the program," David explained, his voice carrying a note of what might have been regret. "But she was asking too many questions about some photographs you'd taken. Images from one of our earlier operations in Utah. We couldn't risk her connecting the dots." Michael remembered the photos David was referring to, a series he'd taken during a landscape shoot in southern Utah, images of remote desert houses that he'd thought captured the stark beauty of isolation. Jenny had looked at them with an artist's eye, noting details about the architecture and the way certain buildings seemed designed to be invisible from the main roads. She'd been fascinated by the deliberate hiddenness of the structures, had even suggested they might make an interesting story for a travel magazine. If she'd pursued that interest, if she'd started investigating the properties, she might have uncovered the truth about what was happening in the desert, so they'd killed her, made it look like an accident, destroyed Michael's world, and then waited patiently for him to seek out the exact kind of isolated retreat that would deliver him into their hands. The mechanical humming was getting louder, and Michael could feel vibrations through the floor that suggested something large and powerful was operating nearby. The air in the chamber was becoming noticeably thinner, and he realized that David wasn't just cutting off the ventilation, he was actively removing oxygen from the room. But knowing the truth about Jenny's death had ignited something in Michael. That 18 months of grief had nearly extinguished. Rage, pure focused anger at the people who had destroyed everything he'd loved, and then used that destruction to manipulate him into their web. Michael wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Jenny, for all the victims whose belongings lined the shelves of this underground tomb, for all the future victims who might be saved if he could find a way to expose the truth. Using David's computer system, Michael began uploading everything he'd found to multiple servers, news organizations, and law enforcement agencies. If the oxygen ran out before he could escape, at least the evidence would survive. The network's client lists, their financial records, their operational procedures, everything that could be used to track down and prosecute the people responsible. But as he worked, Michael also searched for another way out. The floor plans he'd found earlier showed that the underground chambers in each house were connected to old mining tunnels that had been incorporated into the network's design. Emergency exits that could be used if the main entrance was compromised. The entrance to the tunnel system was hidden behind a bookshelf that had looked purely decorative when Michael first saw it. But according to the plans, it opened onto a passage that led to an abandoned mine shaft about 3 kilometers away, far enough from the house to avoid David's immediate surveillance, close enough that Michael might be able to reach it before the oxygen ran out completely. As Michael prepared to make his desperate escape attempt, he heard David's voice one final time. "You can run if you want, Michael. You might even make it to the surface, but you'll never really escape. We know everything about you, everyone you care about, every place you might try to hide. Even if you survive today, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for us to finish what we started." But David Martinez had underestimated the power of a man who had nothing left to lose. Michael Stevens had already lost everything that mattered to him. Jenny was gone. His old life was destroyed, and now he knew that even her death had been a lie. The only thing he had left was the truth, and he was going to make sure that truth destroyed David's network as completely as David had destroyed his life. The bookshelf swung open to reveal a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. Michael grabbed a flashlight from David's equipment shelf and stepped into the passage, leaving behind the underground chamber where so many victims had met their end. Behind him, the oxygen continued to thin, and the mechanical systems hummed with lethal purpose. Above him, David and his team waited for their latest victim to suffocate in the tomb they'd created. But ahead of him lay a chance, slim but real, to escape into the desert darkness and begin the fight that would bring their reign of terror to an end. Michael Stevens walked into the tunnel carrying the weight of all the victims who hadn't been able to escape, all the families who'd never learned the truth about their missing loved ones, and all the future victims who were counting on him to survive long enough to expose the network that had consumed so many lives. The desert had kept its secrets for years, but now those secrets were about to explode into the light of day. The truth was finally going to set the victims free, even if it destroyed everyone involved in the process. Michael disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, racing against time and the thin desert air, carrying the evidence that would bring justice to the dead and salvation to the living. The final chapter of the Desert House nightmare was about to begin. The tunnel was ancient, carved through solid rock by miners who'd worked these hills generations ago, long before the desert became a hunting ground for predators like David Martinez. Michael's flashlight beam revealed rough walls and a ceiling that sometimes dropped so low he had to crawl, but the passage was solid and well preserved by the dry desert air. Every breath was precious now. The oxygen in his lungs was all he had until he reached the surface, and Michael forced himself to move steadily, but not frantically, conserving energy while putting distance between himself and the death trap he'd escaped. Behind him, the tunnel disappeared into darkness that he prayed David and his team wouldn't think to explore until it was too late. The passage angled upward gradually, following the natural contours of the rock formation. According to the floor, plans Michael had memorized, it would emerge in a concealed opening about 2 miles from the house, hidden among a cluster of boulders that would provide cover while he figured out his next move. If he could reach that exit, if he could get back to civilization with the evidence he'd gathered, then David's network of death houses would finally be exposed. But with each step, Michael was also thinking about Jenny, about the 18 months he'd spent mourning an accident that had never been an accident at all, about the guilt he'd carried, wondering if he could have somehow prevented her death, never knowing that it had been murder disguised as random tragedy. The rage that fueled his escape was matched by a grief that felt fresh and raw, as if he was losing her all over again. They'd killed her because she'd seen too much, understood too much about the photographs Michael had taken innocently, never suspecting they documented the infrastructure of a murder network. Jenny's artist's eye had caught details that others had missed, and that perception had signed her death warrant. Now, crawling through ancient stone passages in the Nevada desert, Michael felt the weight of that knowledge settling into his bones. He wasn't just a victim who'd escaped. He was a witness to something that went far beyond his own suffering. Every person on those client lists, every victim whose belongings lined David's shelves, every family that had lost someone to the desert houses, they all deserved justice. The tunnel began to curve upward more sharply, and Michael could feel air movement that suggested he was approaching the surface. His flashlight was starting to dim, but there was something ahead that looked different from the solid rock walls he'd been following. An opening, partially concealed by fallen stones but definitely leading upward toward what might be starlight. Michael squeezed through the gap and found himself in a vertical shaft that had been carved straight up through the rock. Ancient wooden supports still held the walls stable, and a series of metal rungs provided handholds for the climb to the surface. The air here was fresher, carrying the clean scent of the desert night. As he climbed, Michael could see stars through the opening above, the same incredible canopy that had seemed so peaceful just days ago before he'd learned the truth about what lay hidden beneath the desert's apparent serenity. Now those stars felt like witnesses to all the horror that had taken place in this seemingly empty landscape. The shaft opened into a natural depression among a cluster of granite boulders. Exactly as the plans had indicated, Michael pulled himself out of the hole and immediately began covering the entrance with loose stones, hiding any evidence that someone had emerged from the underground tunnels. If David's team came looking, they wouldn't find obvious signs of his escape route. From his position among the rocks, Michael could see the distant glow of lights at the house. David and his accomplices were still there, probably still waiting for him to suffocate in the underground chamber. They had no idea that their victim had escaped, that their entire operation was about to be exposed to the world. But Michael's situation was still desperate. He was alone in the desert, miles from the nearest road with no transportation and no way to contact the outside world. Even if he walked all night, it would be hours before he reached any kind of help. And once David realized he'd escaped, the hunt would begin in earnest. Michael needed to think strategically, to use the knowledge he'd gained about the network's operations to stay ahead of his pursuers. The floor plans he'd studied showed several other properties in the area, some of them connected by underground passages, others serving as safe houses for the organization's members. David would expect him to head for the main highway, so Michael needed to do something unexpected. Looking at the star patterns he'd learned to recognize during his nights at the house, Michael oriented himself and began walking in the direction that would take him toward Pahrump, the nearest town of any size. But instead of following the direct route, he planned to circle wide through the desert, avoiding the roads and obvious paths that David's team would monitor. It was a gamble that might cost him his life if he got lost or ran out of water, but it was better than walking straight into another trap. As he walked, Michael thought about the evidence he'd uploaded from David's computer system. By now, FBI cybercrime units would be analyzing the files and investigators would be preparing search warrants for the properties identified in the network's documents. The client lists would lead to arrests across the country, and the financial records would help trace the full scope of the organization. But Michael also knew that David and his team would realize their exposure soon enough. They'd begin destroying evidence, eliminating witnesses, and disappearing into new identities they'd probably prepared years ago. The window for capturing the leadership of the network was narrow, and it was closing with every hour that passed. The desert night was cold, and Michael's light clothing wasn't adequate for the dropping temperatures, but he kept walking, driven by the knowledge that every step took him closer to justice for Jenny and all the other victims. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional weight he'd been carrying since her death, a weight that had finally found its true target. It was just before dawn when Michael heard the sound he'd been dreading. Helicopters, multiple aircraft, flying search patterns across the desert, their spotlights sweeping the landscape in methodical grids. David had realized his escape and was using every resource at his disposal to recapture him. Michael dove for cover among a cluster of Joshua trees, pressing himself flat against the sandy ground as the choppers passed overhead. The spotlights were military-grade, turning night into day wherever they focused, and Michael realized that David's organization had access to equipment and personnel that went far beyond what a simple murder network should have been able to acquire. This wasn't just about killing isolated tourists for their belongings. This was something larger, more connected, possibly involving people with government or military resources. The scope of the conspiracy was even more vast than Michael had imagined. But as the helicopters moved on, continuing their search pattern, Michael also heard something else that filled him with hope: the distant sound of sirens. Multiple vehicles approaching from the direction of the main highway, moving fast and with purpose. The evidence he'd uploaded was having its effect. Law enforcement was responding, and responding in force. Michael changed direction, heading toward the sounds of the sirens, instead of continuing toward Pahrump. If federal agents were already moving on the house, then he needed to reach them before David's team could eliminate him as a witness. The race was on between justice and cover-up, and Michael Stevens was the key piece that would determine which side won. As the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Michael saw vehicles with flashing lights converging on the house in the distance. FBI, ATF, local sheriff's departments. It looked like every law enforcement agency in Nevada was responding to what they'd found in the uploaded files. But he also saw other vehicles fleeing the scene, racing across the desert, on roads he hadn't known existed, carrying David and his associates toward escape routes they'd prepared for exactly this contingency. The network was scattering, but whether they could disappear before being caught would depend on how quickly the authorities could process and act on the evidence. Michael stumbled toward the law enforcement convoy, waving his arms and shouting, hoping they'd see him before any remaining members of David's team could eliminate the witness who'd exposed their operation. The desert sunrise painted everything in gold and red, the same beautiful colors that had seemed so peaceful during his first morning at the house. Now those colors looked like hope. Hope that justice would finally come to the desert, that the families of the disappeared would finally learn the truth, that the network of death houses would be permanently shut down. As FBI agents spotted Michael and began moving toward him, across the sandy terrain, he allowed himself to believe for the first time since Jenny's death that he might actually survive to see the end of this nightmare. The truth was out, the evidence was secure, and the hunt for David Martinez and his accomplices was just beginning. The desert had finally given up its secrets, and Michael Stevens had lived to tell the story. But even as the agents reached him, as he began to share everything he'd learned about the network's operations, Michael knew that his fight was far from over. David Martinez was still out there, along with the wealthy clients who'd funded the operation and the other members of the organization who'd helped carry out the murders. The investigation that was about to begin would span years and involve law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The trials would be complex and lengthy, with survivors' testimony crucial to securing convictions. Michael would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, Knowing that anyone connected to the network who escaped, justice would have every reason to want him dead. But for the first time since Jenny's death, Michael felt like he had a purpose that went beyond his own grief. He was going to see this through to the end, no matter how long it took or how dangerous it became. He was going to make sure that every victim was remembered, every perpetrator was punished, and every family got the answers they deserved. The sun was fully up now, turning the Nevada desert into a landscape of infinite possibility. Somewhere, out there, David Martinez was running, but he couldn't run forever. The truth had a way of catching up with people no matter how carefully they planned their escapes. Michael Stevens had survived the desert house, but more importantly, he'd made sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he'd gone through. The network of death was broken, and the healing could finally begin. For Jenny, for all the victims, and for every family that had suffered in silence, justice was finally coming to the desert. End of story. The evidence that Michael Stevens risked his life to expose led to one of the largest criminal investigations in modern American history. Over the following 3 years, federal agents arrested more than 40 people connected to the Desert House network, including wealthy clients who had paid to participate in the murders and government contractors who had provided equipment and resources. David Martinez was captured 6 months later in Mexico, where he was living under a false identity. He was extradited to face charges including multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. His trial revealed the full scope of the network's operations and brought closure to dozens of families who had lost loved ones to what they thought were random disappearances. Michael's photographs and testimony were crucial to securing convictions. He established a foundation in Jenny's name that provides support to families of missing persons and funds advanced forensic investigations in remote areas. He still lives with the weight of what he experienced, but he's found purpose in helping others find the truth about their missing loved ones. The story of the Desert House reminds us that the places we go to heal and find peace can sometimes hide the darkest secrets. But it also shows us that truth has a power that no amount of planning or concealment can ultimately defeat. When we refuse to give up, when we fight for justice even in the face of impossible odds, we honor not just our own survival, but the memory of everyone who didn't make it home. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the importance of never giving up on the truth, please share it with others. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected to stories that matter, stories that remind us of both the darkness we're capable of and the light we can create when we refuse to stay silent. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when you had to be brave, when you had to fight for what was right even when you were afraid. Because that's what Michael Stevens did in that desert house. He chose courage over fear, truth over safety, and justice over silence. And because of that choice, families finally got answers, predators were brought to justice, and the desert gave up its secrets at last. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for caring about the stories of people like Michael and Jenny, for remembering that behind every true crime case are real people who deserved better. Together we can make sure their stories are never forgotten.